ComC.com is your home for buying, selling, and flipping all of the hottest trading cards. Their consignment marketplace is home to over 23 million cards across all major eras and genres. With a ComC.com account, you can purchase cards from different sellers over time and ship them home together later, or immediately reprice them for sale on the ComC marketplace to try and flip. To continue serving collectors as our hobby grows, ComC is actively hiring for a range of different roles. Learn more and apply online at comc.com/jobs. You're listening to the WaxPackHero Sports Card Minute, a podcast where we discuss both the hobby and business sides of collecting. I'm your host, Mike Sommer, and I want to help you buy, sell, and trade your way into a collection you'll love. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the 110th episode of the WaxPackHero Sports Card Minute. For today's conversation, I've invited on another fellow podcaster. Matt Sammon is the host of the Wax Ecstatic podcast, and it's one that I have been listening to since my return from the hobby. I guess probably not exactly since my return because the show's not been out for 5 full years. But as I started to expand my hobby education and my hobby knowledge and my enjoyment of hobby content, the Wax Ecstatic podcast was one of the first ones that came across my Apple Podcast feed. And so when I got to that point, I've been listening to the show, and I really appreciate Matt's enjoyment and love and celebration of the cards from our past. He really focuses in on the junk wax era and back, and doesn't put as much emphasis on the modern era, outside of a few cards and a few sets like Topps Heritage, which celebrate some of those cards from our past. I wanted to bring Matt on so you could hear from him and learn more about his show, and if you're looking to expand your hobby options, his show, the Wax Ecstatic podcast, might be another one to check out. And I think you should also check out Underdog Collectibles, the online shop run by collectors for collectors. They break new product every Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday night. And you can find out all of the products that they're going to be breaking at their website, udogcollect.com. You can also join their Facebook group where collectors get together to celebrate their hits, ask questions, and just talk about the hobby. And you can watch them live on YouTube. Check them out at udogcollect.com and tell them WaxPackHero sent you. Now here's our conversation with Matt. Matt, welcome to the show.
Well, Mike, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, I wanted to bring you on because your podcast, the Wax Ecstatic podcast, is one that I've listened to for several years now. I don't know that it's been since the very beginning of the show, but it's definitely been for multiple seasons worth of your show. And it's something that I've always enjoyed, especially as a collector and with a collector focus in mind. And so I wanted to bring you on and give you a chance to help some other people potentially find the show. And I think they'll probably enjoy it as much as I do. So maybe we can start by you just telling us a little bit about your show, the Wax Ecstatic podcast.
Well, thanks, Mike, for being a longtime listener and, for basically outing yourself as that guy who's actually been listening for a long time, because not everybody would want to admit it. Wax Ecstatic, it's so funny. It's kind of gone through, various changes, and we're actually kind of going through a little bit of a change now, in a good way, which I'll get to. But, to go to the very beginning, it actually started just as an idea that was born out of boredom. And, when I really got back into collecting like 100%, I'd say probably around 2013, 2014. I had kind of dabbled in it, 2004, 2005, kind of coming back. But when my son was about 4 years old, I thought, this will be fun because he likes watching baseball and really participating in sports. I thought, this will be fun to get him into baseball cards. And, I'd buy a few packs and we'd open them and talk about the teams and the players. And, really got me completely interested in the hobby again. And sometime early in the summer of 2016, I'm just looking for something to do. I used to work for a National Hockey League team, so the summers were often dull and boring because typically after July 1st, there wasn't a whole lot going on. And that was the case, up until about Labor Day when the camps would start again. So I'm sitting around summer of 2016, and I opined on this on Twitter because that's what people do. I said, who would be interested in, a podcast about just old, 1980s baseball cards? And, I had a few people respond. I thought, okay. And the general idea was I had this monster box of cards from 1981 to 1987 that was actually in this big monster box. And I had a couple other smaller boxes that had 88 through 93. The cards that I didn't sell at an incredible bargain many years ago just to get them out of my house. And I thought, okay, I'm going to go year by year and set by set. And I'm going to pick a random card and I'm going to talk about the set and my memories of it, and do a little research about the player that I pull. And at first I was kind of thinking it would be almost like an MST3K in the sense that if you look back at some of the cards, especially from the 80s, there are some goofy names, there are some goofy pictures, there's some bad cards. And the first card that I pulled, we did 81 Fleer. That was our first set. And the first card that I pulled was Larry Cox. And if you look at the 81 Fleer Larry Cox, Larry Cox was basically a backup catcher. He was with the Seattle Mariners at the time. 81 Fleer, we all know the photo quality is not that great. So it was kind of a dark picture. He was, I believe, in Fenway Park. It was a cloudy day, you could tell. And he's just kind of standing there with his glove kind of like covering his crotch. He's just kind of standing around. And I remember looking at this card going, oh, this will be great. Look at this guy. Here's just this frumpy catcher on a bad team. And he's, almost emasculating himself, just putting his catcher's mitt over his crotch. So then I did a little research on Larry Cox, and I discovered that, Larry Cox, yes, he was a utility catcher and bounced around, but he was very much loved. Became a loved coach for the Chicago Cubs in the late 80s, and tragically died in 1990 while playing a pickup basketball game with his son. And I'm reading this story, and all of a sudden we go from MST3K to VH1 Behind the Music. It's all just like boom, like, oh, wow. And that, and I will always credit the general direction that the show went in to the late Larry Cox, because what started as, hey, let's make fun of some baseball cards, turned into there's an interesting story here. So that's how it started. Again, about 4.5 years ago. There was a little break in between. I needed a little time off to kind of reassess me doing the podcast. It was probably about 7 or 8 months, but really over the last 4.5 years, I've had a blast looking at pretty much every major release since 1949 Bowman, and some offshoot products since then. And for me, the fun isn't just talking about the set or a particular card, but diving into some of the stories about these players, because I've been able to create this saying for the show that there may be common cards, but there are no common players. There's no common story. And I think when you really dive deep into some of these cards that we would normally just cast aside or throw out or put in a box and sell for a penny a piece, there's some interesting stories there, even for the guys that only played for a handful of games or a handful of seasons, as the case may be.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that really attracted me to the show at the beginning, is not only did you do kind of a complete rundown of the product of the week that you were going to be covering, but those random pulls, as you called them, from the monster box, you never knew who you were going to be highlighting. Sometimes it was the big star that came out of that pull, and sometimes it was those more minor stars, or the guys that are often overlooked and nobody digs into. And because nobody else is really digging into those guys, I felt like your show provided a unique take on that, which not a lot of other people did. And so, yeah, that deep dive in combination with the deep dive on the set itself is one of the things that I liked a lot about it. Was that something, I know you said you did it kind of from the very beginning, but was that part of the original plan to dig into those people, or did that just kind of come up?
That was part of the original plan. And, as I was formulating the plan, and just kind of randomly pulling cards out of this monster box going, okay, if I were to actually randomly, and they were and in many cases they still are, like we'll do some video breaks on whatever set we're talking about if we have some packs, or a most recent episode we were comparing 72 tops to the tops heritage set this year. So I normally just like to, okay, let's talk this guy, but at the very beginning it's like, all right, if I were to just reach into this stack of 281 Fleer cards and pull a player, would I be able to have enough to talk about? Would I find something interesting? So yeah, that was always the design. And I think it's something that, while it was kind of this unique piece of the general idea, the initial idea, it kind of grew into this very interesting subtopic where you never know who you're going to talk about. And I've discovered, especially during the pack breaks, I've discovered as I'm flipping through these cards, is if it's a pack from, say, the late 80s or early 90s when I was first collecting as a kid, sometimes it's just a name that rings a bell. And maybe it's a funny name, like Archie Cianfrocco is that's just one of those names. And you go, all right, let's talk about Archie Cianfrocco. What happened to him? And you discover, all right, he was with Montreal for a bit. He was a fan favorite in San Diego, and you find some interesting facts here. So what started, and I've realized this happens in a lot of cases with a lot of good ideas, what starts as just kind of a little ancillary piece just slowly, becomes part of the main narrative. And it's a lot of fun because you, the listener, you don't know who I'm going to talk about. And honestly, 99% of the time, until I'm opening a pack or flipping through pages or looking through a stack of cards, I don't know who I'm talking about. So I get to learn a little bit about these players as well.
I've got a little logistical question for you, because as a fellow podcaster, I'm often intrigued by some of the behind the scenes work. And so one of the things that I wanted to ask briefly about was the pace and release timing of your episodes changed over time. Yep. And I was wondering, what was the major driver of that? Why did you adjust that release schedule?
Well, I think the original release schedule was 2 podcasts a week. And the podcast, let's see, I used to do it Tuesdays and Fridays. And the original podcast only ran, I want to say, about 45 minutes on average. So it wasn't that hard. I didn't have a lot of guests. I typically just would host the show myself, and often still do. Occasionally I'll bring a guest on, as you're well aware of. And, I remember just cranking out these podcasts and at first thinking, well, this will be a good exercise for me to continue my on-air activities, and, just be a good announcer. And the other thing was, let me just crank these out and see if we can get something rolling. And that's kind of a backstory to my career, is that I'm often very ambitious with launching something, which is great because you're telling everybody, hey, here it is. The downside, as I found out, and especially with Wax Ecstatic, was sometimes it can be a little too much and you have to reel it in a bit. So that's what I had to do, because the podcast started getting lengthier. They hit an hour. Sometimes they go an hour and a half. And then it's, even if it's just me talking, there's still production time and putting it together and posting it and scheduling tweets and everything. So I dialed that back to once a week, and then I dialed it back to every other Friday, simply because I was getting feedback from listeners. They're like, oh, hey, you're talking about this set this week. That's great. I'm still 20 episodes behind. It's like, oh, okay, I'm making too much for you. So, we scaled it back there. And I think we found a comfortable spot with every other Friday. It's something that you can schedule even in an on-demand world. You can still kind of mark your calendar and go, the next show is coming up this Friday. And we, put it at noon Eastern. That's when it's released. So, the time of day. And, part of the metamorphosis of the program that I'm working on right now, Mike, is, trying to shut up a little bit. I'm trying to bring the length of the show back down to about an hour, because, sometimes it's a chore for me if I'm talking for an hour and a half. I can only imagine what it's like for the listener. So, it's always changing, always growing, and in a good way. too. But that's kind of how it's adjusted over the years. And like I said, it's happening again.
It's amazing how you learn on the fly, and when you're open and willing to be able to adapt and adjust, how much that seems to help. My show was the same way. I started at 2 a week for the first 9 or 10 months. And that just eventually got to the point where I think I need to adjust this a little bit and move to that once a week schedule. Now, like you mentioned earlier, you've covered sets from the 50s through today, but you also, like me, have an affinity for some of those junk wax era sets. And, for years we've been able to joke that some of those dealers were almost willing to pay you to take those boxes and packs and cards, but that's changed a little bit over the last year or so. What is it about that era of sets that attracts you to them? I think I know the answer, but I want to make sure I have that clarity from you.
Well, the big thing that drew it to me was those were the sets that I collected. I started collecting in 1989. So, I mean, just right in the wheelhouse of junk wax. And it was also roughly around that time. So I was 10 turning 11. I went from being kind of a casual sports fan, like I played sports. I would watch sports, but I wasn't like this nerd about sports. But around 10 or 11, just something switched to where all of a sudden I had to watch every sport. I had to learn about every sport. I wanted to learn about the history, the logos, the team names. And now I'm turning into a guy that's wearing, Ebbetsfield flannels t-shirts, that's where I am now. But, there was just a very transformative time in my life where I went from just kid on the t-ball team to, okay, now I have to buy this jersey or I want this hat, and baseball cards came in at the same time. And I just went full bore baseball card collector for probably the next 4 or 5 years, up until basically the 1994 season. Of course, there was the strike in 1994, which curtailed a lot of interest in not just the hobby, but baseball. But also by then I was, 16 years old. And, you start focusing on other things. Then you're buying a car, you're chasing girls, you're, trying to make money with a job. And, you just kind of lose interest there. So even though, and I often joke on the podcast, like I'm not paying down student loan debt or mortgages with these cards, even though there's plenty of these out there, they bring back some great memories for me. And, I was a little unusual at the time too, where I didn't just buy the new stuff. But, as a young teenager, because again, I was interested in the history of the game, I would go to flea markets, I would go to garage sales, I would go to card shows, and, those beat up cards from the 60s and 70s, that book value were maybe 25 or 50 cents, I'd buy them up. So, I started, developing an itch for vintage cards at the same time. And by the time I got out of the hobby in the mid 90s and came back, like I said, about 10, 12 years later, I had an appreciation for the whole spectrum of them. So, I love all the cards, but it's just those good memories of, being a teenager, being a nerd, and, collecting all these cards that kind of brings me back to junk wax. Plus the fact that I'm cheap. So, you can get the junk wax cheap. But, it's funny, Mike, we're kind of, we're the cool nerds now, aren't we? Because thanks to COVID and what I've called 90s nostalgia, a lot of people are getting back into it. And all of a sudden we don't look so silly or as silly, stacking up all those Greg Jeffries and Hensley Mulin's rookie cards from our youth.
Yeah, over this last year, some of these products that you would be able to find for $5 a box all day, and dealers just wanted to get rid of them, are now sometimes $15 to $30 a box.
Yeah.
And some of the old basketball boxes that we're selling for 10 to 20 bucks are going for 75 to 100. And so some of the folks like us who are maybe a little bit of those junk wax hoarders, we were getting teased and made fun of for liking that stuff. And now we're kind of laughing all the way to the bank if you've got any kind of supply of it, because even
Yeah.
the singles from that era are starting to gain more popularity. I know you and Nick Duante talked a little bit about this recently, but do you have any thoughts on what your perspective is on why we've seen somewhat of a resurgence in some of those junk era products and junk era players from the
Mhm.
80s and 90s?
Well, and I'll start with the players. A lot of it is, now who is a Hall of Famer. We can joke about all the Greg Jeffries and Kevin Moss cards, that we used to hoard, and Todd Van Poppel, and those players didn't really pan out as Hall of Famers, but you know 263rd round picks like Mike Piazza are. So, there's no guessing anymore. If you open up a pack from, say, 1991 and there's a Tom Glavine or a Frank Thomas or Ken Griffey Jr., that card is going to have a little more value, especially if you go out and get it graded. So, yeah, there's a lot less guessing now when it comes to the players and knowing which cards are going to be most valuable. On the other hand, and I brought this up about 90s nostalgia, I think if you just look at, what the world, but in particular the United States, has gone through over the last certainly year, and I stretch it out even to a year and a half, with the COVID pandemic, with the economic ups and downs, with the turmoil from the presidential election and the aftermath from it. We've been through a lot of crap. And regardless of your leanings or beliefs on any of those topics I brought up, we've all been, and I think we're all kind of coming out of our caves here, but we've all been hunkering down for about the last year. So what do you do when you have to hunker down? Not just physically because you don't want to get sick, but mentally and emotionally too, because you're in your safe spot. You go back to when you felt good. Well, when did you feel good? Well, when you were a kid and all you had to do was eat macaroni and Coca-Cola. You didn't care about your health. You didn't have to pay that mortgage or student loans, or, take care of 2, 3, 8 kids, however many you have. And, the most common time frame is you go back to, when you were, 8, 9, 10 years old, maybe a little older. And for most people, most responsible adults who are married and have kids and have that mortgage, that takes you back about 30 years ago. So, it's comfort food. That's what it is. And, I think some people were just longing for something fun. So they would go online and just buy some old packs of cards, or, those 500 card lots that people were willing to sell you for $5. They took a hit on shipping just to get it out of their house. And, on top of that, I think some people probably opened up the closet that, they haven't, opened up in years, and they found a few boxes and went through them. And again, Hall of Famers, they've decided to grade the cards, and then all of a sudden, boom, now that box of 92 Fleer packs that, a dealer would gladly give you for $10 at the card show, all of a sudden it's priced at 20. Now, and I like to caution my listeners on this, that doesn't mean you're going to get $20 worth of cards. It's still 92 Fleer. There's still 20 million of these cards out there. But like you said, for those who have hoarded it, for those who have sat on these boxes for all these years, there's a little bit of return on investment. Still, nobody's getting rich. It's just some people are less in debt because they can finally clear out some warehouse space for these cards.
Now, you've talked about how the show has evolved over time, how it's continuing to evolve. What's next for Wax Ecstatic?
Well, there's, like I said, the evolution of just trying to shorten the show just a little bit. And, I joke about how I can talk and talk and talk, and I can. But, just trying to make it a little more consumer friendly. I've got a great loyal fan base. I'm so glad that, listeners such as yourself tune in for every show. But I still want it to be enjoyable and not a chore. Shortening it, like I said, is one of the goals, but without cutting out the content. People still listen, even if it does run long, because we're entertaining you somehow, some way. So we still have the staples like, talking about the particular cards or the topics. For example, the next show that I'm working on this week is what I call the food stuff cards. So the cards that are associated with like Coca-Cola or Burger King or Denny's Grand Slam, for example. There's all sorts of food related cards over the decades that we're going to talk a little bit about. So, talk a little bit about the topic and the cards, and we're picking 3 players now. So some of those favorite things are still out there. What the biggest change is going to be moving forward, and this is something that's going to take several weeks, if not a couple months to develop, is I've got the domain waxandgumstains.com, which plays off of our Twitter handle, Wax and Gumstains, and we're going to have a website. And a lot of the, what I've called housekeeping that has been on the show will kind of reside there. But also, for those times where I just can't stay quiet in between 2 weeks, where the show is, maybe it's just blogging, just a random thought about, a particular card or some moment in, that night's baseball game. And I've had a lot of feedback from listeners too on, hey, it's okay to talk about something other than baseball. All right. So, if I find some cool hockey cards in my collection, maybe I'll post a couple pictures and just throw it out there. So having a place for collectors outside of the podcast is kind of the next goal. And we'll see where it goes from there, because it was maybe 2 or 3 months ago where I'm kind of looking at the podcast and going, all right, yeah, this was just one of those ideas born out of boredom, but it's still going. there is something here. So, all right, let's see what else we can pull from this, without, taking up too much of my time, but, just something that the podcast is still front and center, but there's a lot of extra stuff along the side just to keep you entertained in between the shows.
I think that's a great idea. I know I found with WaxPackHero.com, there's a different audience that goes to the website only versus the people who find me via the podcast. And so I think while there, again, is some overlap and crossover between those two, there's definitely some different audiences who may well enjoy that written form more than the podcast form. And so I think that's a great idea to kind of expand your reach. That sounds awesome. Well, where can people find you and where can people find the show?
Well, like I said, waxandgumstains.com, we will eventually get that online within the next couple of months. So I already own the domain. You're not going to buy it from me. But, do check it out. Probably late summer, we'll get that going. In the meantime, you can look for Wax Ecstatic on pretty much every podcast service. Just search Wax Ecstatic, and you'll see our logo and a brief description, and it's all about baseball cards. You can't miss it. So we are on Apple Podcasts, also iHeartRadio, Spotify, TuneIn, Stitcher, Blueberry, Google Play. It's pretty much everywhere. Also, Audio Boom, that's our home base. So if you subscribe to Audio Boom, that's a great place to get it too. And our Twitter handle is @WaxandGumstains, and that is where you'll see the links for shows, video breaks. And also, speaking of video, I've created a new YouTube channel. It used to be just my personal YouTube channel off of my personal Gmail, but I've created waxandgumstains@gmail.com. So if you want to watch video breaks, we moved about 20 of the videos over there, and we're starting to build the crowd there. So whether you like video, whether you like audio, whether you like snappy tweets, and soon some website content, it's all out there in various forms and fashions.
And I will be sure to link to all that stuff in the show notes. And so if you didn't catch it as Matt was just describing it, you can go to the show notes and find the links to all of those social outlets and the show itself. So Matt, thanks for coming on today. I really appreciate having the conversation and giving people a chance to hear more about your show and the origin story.
Well, Mike, thanks again for having me on and for being a longtime listener. I joke that you're the guy and we finally found you. But, if this show didn't have dedicated fans, not only would we not have this conversation today, I would have given up on it. I wouldn't have come back from my little sabbatical. But I'm glad that we're able to entertain, and even if it's with those cards that don't make you a ton of money, but bring back a ton of good memories. So again, I appreciate you listening and having me on today.
Thanks again, Matt. I hope you enjoyed hearing a little bit more about Matt and his show. I definitely would encourage you to check it out. And I definitely encourage you to let me know how you enjoyed this show. Leave me some feedback at waxpackhero@gmail.com. Reach out to me on Twitter at @TheMikeSummer. And as always, please leave a rating and review at your podcast app of choice. I would really appreciate it. Well, that's all I've got for you today. I'll catch you next time.